Hello, welcome to our lecture on Civil War. As we'll just jump right into it. We have the two armies here. So the Union had a few advantages. So their population was about 25 times larger than the South. They had more railroad track and about 10 times the industrial capacity, which at face value makes it look like it's a little bit of a hopeless cause for the Confederacy. But the South did have power as well. So for one, they only needed to defend their own land. They weren't planning on making voyages up to the north to go fight there. And so they knew the landscape of the South really well. They had an intelligence network that could relay information about Union movement in the South. And so that meant that the North had to invade, conquer, and destroy the South in rebellious areas. So they needed thousands of troops to defend and maintain their supply lines, in addition to troops that would be fighting. So that definitely lowered their manpower advantage. Let's talk a little bit about the two different presidents. So here we have Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis was kind of known as like a micromanager. He liked being in control of every aspect of things he was able to. A little bit about him: he was raised in Mississippi, and he had a lot of experience. So he was educated at West Point, he was Secretary of War, he had been a senator for a while, and he fought in the Mexican-American War. So he was a hardworking guy and committed, but he was also fairly bitter, wasn't good at hearing criticism, sort of played favorites among people. But he did have a really daunting task of defending states' rights while also increasing power of the central government in order to be successful at this war. Lincoln, on the other hand, was kind of known for his cautious determination. He was fairly new at what he was doing. He had served one term in the House of Representatives. He was professional and didn't focus on personal criticism and insults or play favorites like Jefferson Davis did. Didn't really indulge in flattery or anything like that. And he was seen as like an actual people's person. So he would go visit soldiers in the field and camps and hospitals. And he was a very effective military leader. So he had accepted advice and different proposals from people, more of a team player. So they were quite different figures. So one piece of advice that Lincoln accepted was this Anaconda Plan, which was Winfield Scott's idea. And it was basically a blockade plan to blockade the Confederacy, cut off supplies, and sort of strangle them into submission. So you can see on this map here, it's, we have an anaconda sort of displaying what the blockade would look like. So all along the coast and working its way around up near the Mississippi River. And Lincoln knew that this wouldn't be the only method they'd be using. There had to be battles, of course, and so we had this plan where they would fight on both the eastern and the western fronts. So fighting battles over near Mississippi, and then also near fighting battles near Virginia, and then also along the Mississippi River here. Another important aspect was keeping the border states. And these are the states of Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and West Virginia. So there are a few things that happened in these states that determined them staying in the Union. So in Maryland, they suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which habeas corpus is either someone's charged with a crime or they're released. So you can't just jail people and not charge them with something. But that was suspended here. So by doing that, prominent Confederate supporters could be held in jail or in prison indefinitely to keep them in there for the duration of the war. And because of that, there was a Union victory in the state elections because those Confederates were being locked up. So Maryland stayed in the Union. In Kentucky, it was kind of a waiting game. They had proclaimed themselves neutral. Lincoln wanted to wait for Kentucky Unionists to sort of assert themselves, and they did. So they won the legislature, and then when the Confederate Army entered the state, they were squashed by the Union, and then Kentucky stayed in the Union. In Missouri, there was some guerrilla warfare going on. A Union victory in 1862 kept Missouri in the Union. Similar divisions and similar type warfare were going on in Virginia, which led to the creation of West Virginia in 1863. And this was an important victory in securing these border states because the population of 5 of those states was equal to the population of 4 that had seceded. Now, production of military supplies was pretty great in these border states as well. Maryland and West Virginia had important railroad lines, which helped for defense of D.C., and Kentucky and Missouri had access to major rivers, which were used in the first successful invasions. All right, so let's talk about the Battle of Bull Run. It took place in Manassas, Virginia. Bull Run was the name of a nearby creek there. So the Union attacked the Confederacy about 20 miles southwest of D.C. The Union had pushed the Confederates back. There was like a midday pause in the battle, and then the South regrouped and counterattacked. The Union Army was largely untrained, and they broke and abandoned the field, which scattered tourists. So one aspect of this war was that some of these battles took place in nearby major cities. So this one was near DC, and as a form of entertainment, a lot of people would go and watch battles taking place. And so that was taking place here at the Battle of Bull Run. So when the Union Army scattered and, started running off, a bunch of these tourists were scattered as well. So the Confederate lost 2,000 people in this battle. The Union lost 3,000. And so the South did win this battle, and it sort of inspired among the Union Army the need for greater training and greater mobilization. And so after this battle, both sides worked on implementing stronger leadership and creating more long-term armies, not these kind of like pop-up armies that they had. All right, so I mentioned briefly the blockade, and so this is fairly effective. In the beginning, the U.S. Navy had about 42 ships and over 3,000 miles of coastline that they had to blockade. So clearly, ships were going to be able to get in and out of that blockade. By 1862, the U.S. Navy had taken islands off the coast of the Carolinas and Georgia and held them as supply bases. They also began building gunboats for the rivers. And with those gunboats, in April of 1862, New Orleans was captured, and then in June, Memphis was captured. So those boats were fairly effective. So with this blockade, only the small, fast ships could pass through, and so the South did suffer greatly because of that. And the South tried to end it at one point. They dabbled in converting ships to these ironclads, and this is an ironclad you see here in this picture, where they converted the USS Merrimack into the Virginia, meaning basically they put a hefty suit of armor on these ships. And so the USS Merrimack, which was now the Virginia, ended up battling a Union ironclad, and it ended up with a standoff. And eventually, the Confederacy sunk this vessel, their own vessel, when they had to evacuate Norfolk, Virginia. And the last real threat to Union sea supremacy was this plan to build these ironclad vessels, and didn't work out. So the South was also hoping for some diplomacy. They hoped that European cotton dependence would mean that they would be able to form alliances, especially with Great Britain. But Great Britain and France, they did seem to favor the South at first. They sort of dismissed the idea that it was a war over slavery, didn't really see the point in forcing the two back together. But cotton distribution was really quite crippled with this blockade. And Europe wasn't really going to act until the South demonstrated it could perform well. And you might remember France did that during the Revolutionary War, waiting to see that the United States could win a major battle. But while they were waiting, France and Great Britain ended up getting cotton from Egypt and India. They didn't really need the South any longer, and so they never recognized the Confederacy or helped in any meaningful way. All right, let's move on and talk about some Western battles. We have a photo here of Ulysses S. Grant. He was the main general on the Western Front. And so we're going to talk about some battles between 1861 and 62. The first Union victory was won by Grant, and he was like this unassuming, quiet guy. Critics of his often mentioned that he drank too much. He had gone to West Point, but then resigned his commission and became a clerk at his father's store. So he's kind of seen as a failure in that regard. He was, though, when he stepped up, he was good at improvising in battles. He remained calm, and one thing that he was really, really good at was utilizing rivers to get inside the Confederacy. And so by doing that, he captured Forts Henry and Donelson and forced Confederates out of Kentucky and mid-Tennessee. He did lose a major battle at Fort Shiloh by surprise Confederate attack, and instead of retreating, counterattacked the next day with reinforcements and retook the field. But the Army did take 23,000 casualties at Fort Shiloh. Okay, meanwhile in the East, a little more chaotic, so this is during the same time period. The Union general in the East was George McClellan, and he was this arrogant guy, but also kind of full of self-doubt and was super cautious in battles, and so he would spend months and months and months training and planning for battles that he was trying to avoid. His counterpart over there, the Confederate general, was General Lee, and he was daring and ready to fight all the time. So we have this 7 days battle that took place. It was 6 battles actually over 7 days in Richmond, Virginia, and it was a mild loss for the Union Army, and the Union Army pulled back to protection of gunboats. Lincoln was frustrated that McClellan made that choice, and he had been hoping that they would counterattack and keep going, but McClellan remained behind protection, worried about losing more soldiers. So Lincoln was frustrated. He ordered that campaign abandoned and formed a new army in that area under a guy named John Pope. John Pope had a heavy loss at the Second Battle of Bull Run, and so Lincoln reinstated George McClellan in command. And then when Lee invaded the North, hoping to have like this super crushing blow, McClellan had discovered his plans and launched a series of poorly planned attacks near Antietam Creek, which Lee repulsed the attacks, but he wasn't able to invade the North, so it was sort of a mild success. But because McClellan allowed for Lee's escape, he was permanently removed from command. That was seen as a failure. He just could not, make a crushing victory against the Confederacy. So he was replaced by a guy named Burnside. Burnside had a heavy loss at Fredericksburg. He was replaced by Hooker. And so on, these generals in the East are just constantly getting replaced. They could not find a successful general to take over there, and that would be a problem for quite a while. Let's talk really quickly about emancipation. Lincoln had been hesitant to push for emancipation during the first year of the war, but in 1858 he had declared the inevitability of the United States becoming either all free or all slave states. But because he was hesitant, he feared that it would be too radical in action, there would be social upheaval, but he was being pushed by radicals to adopt an emancipation policy, arguing that it would hasten the war's end. But Lincoln, time and time again, said his first priority was to save the Union, whichever that meant. So during his first year of the war, he refused to talk about emancipation. And we'll pause right there, and we'll come back and finish this slide in just a moment.